24F, sex worker fell in love with one of my client, because he knows how to have sex and make me feel good in bed, but he ruined my life, and now I can't leave him because no one can make me feel like he does. Okay, Reddit, this is a really complicated and honestly embarrassing situation. I know I'm going to get dragged for this, but I need to get it out because I'm stuck in this loop and I don't know how to get out. I'm a sex worker, have been for a couple of years, and recently, I fell hard for one of my clients. The thing is, I'm starting to realize he's completely wrong for me, but I can't seem to let him go. I know it's not healthy, but I'm trapped. So, a little backstory. I started escorting when I was 22. It wasn't my dream job, but I was struggling with bills, and it seemed like the easiest way to make good money fast. Most of my clients were pretty standard, nothing special. We'd meet up, do the deed, they'd pay me, and that was it. I never caught feelings, and I liked keeping it that way. I never got attached to anyone, and I kept it professional. Then he came into my life. Let's call him Ryan, 38M. Ryan was different, not in the usual sense like he was super hot, funny, or had a great personality. In fact, he wasn't really any of that. He wasn't particularly attractive, he wasn't charming, and honestly, he wasn't even a nice guy. But the thing that got me hooked was how good he was in bed. I've had a lot of clients, but Ryan was something else. He knew how to make me feel things that no one else had ever made me feel before. Every time we were together, it was like he could read my body perfectly. I'd never experienced sex like that in my life. I felt like I was addicted to the way he made me feel physically, and before I knew it, I was starting to crave seeing him more and more. It wasn't long before I started confusing those feelings with love. I convinced myself that maybe this was something special. Maybe this guy wasn't like my other clients, maybe we had some sort of real connection. I ignored all the red flags because I was so caught up in how he made me feel in bed. But here's where things get messy. Outside the bedroom, Ryan is a complete disaster. He's an alcoholic, constantly drinking whenever we're together. At first, I didn't think much of it, lots of people drink, right? But it quickly became clear that he had a serious problem. He would get drunk and start acting erratic, sometimes verbally abusive, yelling at me over nothing. He'd get paranoid, accusing me of sleeping with other guys, even though, I'm a sex worker, and he'd make me feel guilty for things I wasn't even doing. I started seeing the worst side of him, but I couldn't leave. I wanted to, so many times. I even tried. I would block his number, tell him I couldn't see him anymore, but within a few days, I'd always find myself going back to him. It wasn't because of love, though. It was because no one else could satisfy me the way he did. He was a mess in every other way, but in bed, he was perfect. It's like he had this hold over me, and no matter how bad things got, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed him just to feel good again. I started canceling appointments with other clients just to see him. He'd show up drunk most of the time, but as soon as we got in bed, everything else disappeared. He was like a drug. I knew he was using me, just treating me like his personal sex toy. He didn't care about me. He never asked how I was doing, never cared about my feelings or what was going on in my life. But I was hooked. I started hating myself for how much I needed him. The worst part? He'd disappear for days or even weeks sometimes, leaving me hanging, waiting for him to call or text. I'd feel this mix of anger, relief, and desperation all at once. I'd tell myself I was done with him for good, but the second he reached out, I'd drop everything and go back to him. It didn't matter how bad he treated me, how much he made me cry or feel like trash, one text from him, and I was running right back. Eventually, my friends started noticing how much I'd changed. I wasn't taking care of myself, wasn't seeing other clients, and my finances were taking a hit because I was too focused on him. I'd make excuses for his behavior, saying things like he's going through a rough time or he's just stressed, but deep down, I knew none of that mattered. I was letting him ruin my life because I couldn't tear myself away from the way he made me feel physically. I tried to convince myself that I loved him, that maybe if I stuck around long enough, he'd change. Maybe he'd stop drinking, maybe he'd treat me better, maybe we could have something real. But the truth is, Ryan wasn't interested in any of that. He just wanted someone he could use, someone who'd let him get away with his shitty behavior as long as he threw them a few moments of pleasure. A few weeks ago, things hit rock bottom. He got so drunk, he trashed my apartment during one of his rants. He called me every name in the book, threw a bottle at the wall, and stormed out. I told myself that was it, that I was finally done. But guess what? 3 days later, I found myself texting him again, asking when he was free. I know I sound pathetic, but I don't know how to break this cycle. Every time I try to walk away, I get sucked back in. I know he's bad for me. I know he's an alcoholic, a user, and probably one of the most toxic people I've ever met. But I can't help it. The way he makes me feel in bed is unlike anything I've ever experienced, and it's like I'm willing to put up with all the horrible things he does just for that feeling. I don't know what to do anymore, Reddit. I'm stuck, and I feel like I'm slowly losing myself to this man who doesn't give a damn about me. Has anyone else been through something like this? How do you walk away from someone who's bad for you, but who you can't stop craving? TLDR, fell in love with a client who is toxic, alcoholic, and abusive, but can't seem to leave him because he's the only one who can satisfy me in bed. Now I'm stuck in a vicious cycle and don't know how to escape. I, 26F, worked as a sex worker for 3 years and learned some wild lessons from my clients. One of them nearly ruined my life. Hey, Reddit. This is kind of a crazy story, and to be honest, I'm not sure how to feel about it. I've been out of the game for about a year now, but looking back, there was one specific event that still shakes me to my core. I'm hoping by writing it out, I can process it and maybe get some perspective from you all. This is going to get wild, so buckle up. So, a little background, I started sex work when I was 23. It wasn't something I ever imagined doing, but I'd just gotten out of a messy breakup, was behind on rent, and my job at a coffee shop wasn't cutting it. I'd heard about OnlyFans, escorting, and sugaring through friends, and after some research, I decided to dip my toes into it. Turns out, I was pretty good at it. I started with camming and built up a small following, but it wasn't long before I moved into in-person work. The money was insane compared to my regular job, and for a while, things were great. The thing is, you quickly learn that not all clients are the same. Some are sweet and respectful, others, not so much. But I had regulars, people who treated me well and tipped big, so I thought I had it all under control. And then he came into my life. Let's call him Matt. Matt was different from any client I'd ever had before. He was rich, like absurdly rich. The kind of guy who would book an entire weekend in a 5-star hotel just to hang out and drop thousands without blinking. When I first met him, I was kind of in awe. He was smooth, charming, and treated me like gold. After our first few sessions, he started asking for exclusive time. He didn't want to just see me for an hour or two, he wanted full weekends, private trips, the whole 9 yards. At first, I thought, hell yeah, this is easy money. Who wouldn't want to be whisked away to luxury hotels and pampered for a few days? But things started to change. Matt wasn't just booking me for a weekend here or there anymore. He was calling me all the time, texting nonstop, and asking where I was, who I was with. It was like he was trying to control every aspect of my life. I chalked it up to him being a high-paying client, maybe just wanting more of my attention. But then it got weirder. One time, we were supposed to meet at a hotel, but when I showed up, he wasn't there. Instead, I got a call from him telling me to go to a specific room where I found another woman, someone I'd never seen before. She was crying, clearly upset. Matt had paid for her time too, but he wanted me to deal with her, because apparently, she'd crossed him in some way. I noped out of there real quick, but that was the first red flag. The second red flag came when I started noticing he was following me outside of our appointments. I'd bump into him accidentally at the grocery store or outside my apartment. He'd make comments about where I'd been, what I was wearing, even though I hadn't told him any of that. One night, he showed up at my apartment unannounced with a gift. It was a necklace, insanely expensive, but the note with it said something like, "Now you're mine forever." It freaked me out. I didn't want to accept it, but I was also afraid of pissing him off. I realized then that I needed to distance myself. I started being more cautious, taking fewer calls, booking less time with him, but it only made things worse. He became obsessed. The final straw came one night when I was out with some friends, trying to unwind after a long week. I hadn't told Matt about my plans, obviously, but somehow, he knew. He showed up at the bar, cornered me, and started making this huge scene, accusing me of cheating on him. He wasn't even my boyfriend. He was screaming at me like I'd broken some unspoken rule between us. It was so bad, my friends had to step in to get him to back off. After that, I blocked his number and told him I couldn't see him anymore. But Matt wasn't the type to take no for an answer. A few days later, I found a letter in my mailbox, no stamp, so I knew he'd been there in person. It was long and rambling, filled with creepy details about my life that I hadn't shared with him. He mentioned things I'd done, places I'd been, and people I'd met, as if he was watching my every move. I was terrified. I knew I had to get out of the situation before things escalated even further. So, I packed my bags and moved in with a friend for a few weeks, while I tried to figure out what to do next. But here's where the story gets even crazier. A few weeks after I'd ghosted Matt, I got a call from one of my regulars. He said something weird had happened. He'd been contacted by someone claiming to be me, offering to meet him for a discounted rate. I had no idea what he was talking about, because I hadn't reached out to any of my clients in weeks. But when I checked the number he'd been texting, it wasn't mine, it was Matt's. He was impersonating me. He was contacting my clients, pretending to be me, trying to lure them into God knows what. It was like he was trying to sabotage my entire life, and he was doing a pretty good job at it. I was panicking at this point, worried that he was going to ruin my business, or worse, hurt someone. I finally decided enough was enough and went to the police. But here's the kicker, they couldn't do anything. Because I hadn't been physically harmed and there was no real threat, they said it was a civil matter. I was furious, scared, and had no idea what to do next. In the end, I had to leave the city. I moved halfway across the country, changed my phone number, and cut ties with nearly everyone from my old life. I didn't feel safe until I completely erased myself from his radar. I've been out of that life for over a year now, but I still think about what could have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. I'm just grateful I escaped with my sanity, mostly, intact. So yeah, Reddit, that's my crazy story. I don't regret my time as a sex worker, it taught me a lot about people and myself, but I will always be haunted by Matt. If you're ever in a situation like that, listen to your gut and get out before it's too late. TLDR, I was a sex worker who got involved with a wealthy client who became obsessed and tried to control my life, eventually impersonating me to my clients. Had to flee the city to escape him. I, 28F, fell in love with a client, but he turned out to be the worst mistake of my life. So, this is going to sound completely insane, but I need to get it off my chest. I've been involved in sex work for a few years now, mostly escorting and the occasional OnlyFans stuff, and I thought I had seen it all. I was always pretty good at keeping emotions out of it, but then this one client came along and flipped my world upside down. Spoiler, it did not end well. I'm still reeling from it, and honestly, I don't know how I'm going to move on. Let me start by saying that I'm not new to this. I've been doing sex work for almost 5 years, and while it's not the most glamorous job, it pays the bills, and I've learned to separate my feelings from the work. I've had regulars, one-offs, and all kinds of weird experiences, but I never let myself get attached. That was the rule. No feelings, no attachments, just business. But, as you probably guessed, that all went out the window when I met him. Let's call him Nick, 36M. Nick wasn't my usual type of client. He wasn't some rich, older businessman or a lonely guy just looking for a connection. He was rough around the edges, not super attractive, and honestly, kind of a jerk. But the second we slept together, I was hooked. It was like he knew exactly what to do to make me feel things I had never felt before. I'm not talking about love, this was pure, physical addiction. He was that good in bed, and it was like nothing else mattered when we were together. The first few times we met, it was strictly business. He'd book a couple of hours, we'd do our thing, and then he'd leave. But after a while, I started looking forward to our sessions. Not because of him as a person, he was kind of rude and didn't have much of a personality, but because he made me feel so damn good in bed. I'd never had that kind of chemistry with anyone, and it was like he could read my body like a book. I started craving him, in a way that scared me. Then things got complicated. He started booking me more frequently, and I wasn't complaining because, hey, money's money. But soon, it wasn't about the money anymore. I found myself texting him outside of appointments, asking when he was free, trying to see him for more than just a job. It was like I had lost all control over myself. I was falling for this guy who had no redeeming qualities except for how he made me feel physically. He wasn't funny, smart, or even kind, he was just really, really good in bed. And somehow, that was enough for me. As you can imagine, that didn't last long. I started seeing the darker side of Nick. He was an alcoholic, and it became pretty clear that he was using me for more than just sex. He'd show up drunk to our meetings, and when he wasn't drunk, he was high. He'd talk down to me, treat me like I was nothing more than a sex toy for his amusement. But I kept going back, because no matter how awful he was outside the bedroom, inside it, he made me feel things I couldn't get anywhere else. One night, after a particularly rough session where he was more wasted than usual, he got violent. Not in a safe or consensual way, but in a way that left me shaken. He grabbed me too hard, yelled at me when I didn't respond the way he wanted, and left me bruised. I knew then that I needed to stop seeing him. This wasn't just unhealthy, it was dangerous. But the problem was, I couldn't. I was addicted to him. I tried to leave him after that night. I blocked his number, told myself I was done, that no amount of good sex was worth the abuse. But after a few days, I started missing him. Not him as a person, but the way he made me feel in bed. No one else could satisfy me like he did, and that craving, that need, pulled me back in. I unblocked him, reached out, and just like that, I was back in his orbit. This cycle went on for months. He'd show up, drunk or high, treat me like garbage, and then blow my mind in bed. I'd hate myself for going back to him, but I couldn't stop. He knew he had power over me, and he used it. Every time I tried to cut him off, he'd say just enough to make me come back, promising he'd be better, but never actually changing. The worst part was that it wasn't just about sex anymore. He started controlling other aspects of my life, too. He didn't like when I saw other clients, so I started canceling appointments. I wasn't making as much money, and I was losing regulars, all because I couldn't get away from this toxic guy. He would berate me for doing my job, accusing me of being with other men even though that's literally what I was paid to do. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I started to believe him. He made me feel like I was the one in the wrong. It all came crashing down when one of my friends, who knew about my situation, finally confronted me. She told me I was destroying my life, that I wasn't the same person anymore, and that Nick was ruining me. She wasn't wrong. I had lost so much of myself in this toxic, abusive relationship that I didn't even recognize who I was anymore. But I still couldn't leave him. It wasn't until Nick showed up one night completely blackout drunk and trashed my apartment that I finally snapped. He was yelling, breaking things, and I realized I was scared of him, not just emotionally, but physically. I knew then that I had to get out for good, or I was going to lose everything. I blocked him on everything, moved to a new apartment, and stopped working for a while just to clear my head. It's been a few months now, and I'm still struggling to move on. I miss him sometimes, even though I know how toxic he was. It's like my brain knows he's bad for me, but my body still craves that feeling he gave me. I'm trying to rebuild my life, but I know it's going to be a long road. If there's one thing I've learned from this whole mess, it's that no amount of good sex is worth destroying yourself over. I just hope I can keep reminding myself of that when the cravings hit. TLDR, fell in love with a client who was incredible in bed but turned out to be an abusive alcoholic. Tried to leave him multiple times, but kept going back, because no one else could satisfy me like he did. Finally got out after he trashed my apartment, but I'm still struggling to move on.